Hi everyone, we'll just wait for everyone to join and then we'll make a start. Yeah. It looks like numbers have leveled out, so we'll make a start. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Hopefully you're in the right place. We're going to talk about CIEEM's policy activities and hopefully give you a bit more background and some examples of what we've been doing lately. And we have got some slides. If I can, do I share the screen first? Let's do that. All right, you should be able to see that. Yep, great. Right, thank you very much. So we are the CIEEM policy team. We'll do some introductions in a moment, but basically, yeah, we're going to talk about CIEEM's policy activities this evening, hopefully give you some insights, and hopefully you can learn a few things, and we'll do some questions at the end. So just to run through what we're going to do, so I'll give you a quick introduction to the policy team. We'll each introduce ourselves. You might find our career journeys interesting. Then I'm going to talk about what we talk about when we're talking about policy, what we're actually talking about, a bit about how it's created. We'll talk then a bit about policy engagement, why we engage, how we engage, and who we engage with. We'll talk about some examples of recent work, then talk about reviewing our activities and how we try to measure impact. Then we've got a bit about careers, which you might be interested in, and then we'll do a Q&A. So if at any point during the talk, if you've got any questions, please just pop them in the Q&A function on the, I think the banner will be on the bottom of your screens. And then we'll come back to the end and we'll answer as many of those as we can. So moving on, just a quick one. You should all know about CIEEM, but I thought I'd pop this in here quickly as well. So we were founded in 1991 as IEEM. But what's that, 34 years, so still relatively young as a professional body. Got our real charter in 2013, which meant we could award Chartered Ecologist, and then also became a registered charity in 2020, which just expands some of the work we're able to do and some of the opportunities for us. We currently have 30 staff and around 8,500 members, and obviously our mission is to raise standards and profile of the professional ecological environmental management sector, but ultimately for the benefit of nature and society. And we have some overarching strategic goals around raising standards, knowledge sharing. You can see some examples there, the podcast and the magazine. If you haven't had a listen to the podcast, the three of us host the podcast, so you might find that interesting. Obviously supporting continuing professional development, so that's conferences, webinars, training workshops, that kind of thing. And then influencing and challenging, which is what we do as a team and what we're going to talk about today. So the policy team is me. My name's Jason. I'm CIEEM's head of policy. We have Ashley, one of the policy officers, and Doug, the other policy officer. They'll both introduce themselves in a minute. In our team, we also have on these, it says project officers. They're actually now called the country coordinators, but we have one each for Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And a small part of their job is to help us out in each of those countries. They do quite a lot, really. But they're then on the ground in each of those countries, able to engage, network, and near to the ground, really good connections with the members in those countries. So a real help when it comes to our policy work. Our chief exec, Sally, is really engaged and interested in policy and is a really great figurehead for us as well in terms of representing the Institute on some policy issues as well. We also have the strategic policy panel, which is our overarching like a policy committee. They look at the big picture stuff, and I'll come to that in the next slide around governance. We have our country policy groups. We have our president and vice presidents. They change every 3 years, so it depends on who they are, but are generally pretty involved and engaged in the policy work as well. Pretty much always have an interest in what we're doing, definitely. And then we have special interest groups and topic specialists. So depending on what we're working on, we may have a special interest group that works on that particular topic, or we have a way to engage with members, particularly on a topic that they might be interested in. And then there's folks like you, so the members more generally, who we rely on for your expertise and experience, and for a younger audience or a early careers audience like yourself, often just a different perspective, a different way to think of things, which is useful for us. So just quickly covering policy governance. The governing board is the overarching decision-making body, and they delegate powers to the strategic policy panel to make decisions on what we do in terms of policy activities. And then we have the country policy groups, one each for England, Scotland, Wales, and all Ireland, and they deal more with the individual national level things that are going on. And then we work with all three of those. And then just a special mention to the Action 2030 working group. So that's our climate change working group, but there is some policy elements to that, and there's overlap, and we're trying to get the SPP and the Action 2030 group to work more closely together as well. So there's an overlap. So moving on to the team, let me introduce you to Ashley, and then she can introduce herself.
Thank you, Jason. So my name's Ashley. I'm one of the two policy officers. There's also Doug, who will also introduce himself shortly. So I'm actually based in Edinburgh, Scotland, but I'm policy officer mainly focusing on the devolved nations in Ireland. So Scotland, Wales, and the island of Ireland, both the North and the Republic. So I started off my career, I guess, in physical geography. I almost did an ecology degree, but suspected that I would like to keep my options open and consider other routes. And physical geography gave my first assignment in policy, so researching for the purpose of influencing policy. So that stayed in my head when I then left my undergraduate degree and volunteered for a local non-profit, where they also ran a stakeholder engagement and policy project, which gave me my first taste of how to design stakeholder discussions. And that fed directly to the Scottish Government. I then continued to meander on and did a PhD on peatlands, change in peatlands and the effect on beetle communities, but I would like to emphasise that you do not need to do a PhD in order to get into policy. That just happened to be my meandering route into it. However, a big part of academic work is explaining the relevance of your work to policy. This is largely how you justify your funding. So something to bear in mind if you do go down that route. I then did, when I finished my PhD, a couple of policy internships. They were very short, part-time, just for a few months, but this did demonstrate my interest in a policy career. But also there are other opportunities to volunteer in policy, including in CIEEM, as you'll find out a little bit more later. I then joined CIEEM in 2023 after many months of job searching. So just to emphasise that it might feel like the right job will never come along for you, whether it's in ecology or more specifically in policy, but it will. And to use your university's career service, they're experts in helping you to hone CVs and practice for interviews.
Thanks, Ashley. Moving on to Doug.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Yeah, I'm Doug. I'm the other policy officer. I'm based in England, and I sort of look at the sort of England and then UK aspect of our policy work and sort of support Jason that element, but also then some of the sort of international work that CIEEM is starting to sort of look into as well. I'm happy to say that, like Ashley, I too was started in physical geography. It's nice to have a good physical geography representation in CIEEM. So I did a BSc in environmental geography. So obviously there was a heavy, landscape, geomorphological focus, and there was a policy focus, but really through the lens of climate change. So looking at climate policy and how that's changing and how that needs to adapt. So that was my first sort of experience of policy and legislation and that sort of world adjacent to the more sort of physical stuff we were doing. I then moved on, did an MSc in global ecology and conservation, sort of honing in on the aspects I found interesting, which turned out to be sort of, ecology, conservation, the sort of wildlife, geography interaction, that element, that sort of, that border. And there really it was looking at how sort of policy and ecology interact. So protected species law is a really good example of that, and those sort of things that ecologists in the UK have to abide by. But it really shows that interaction between policy, science, and legislation. So then after that, I sort of, I worked as an ecologist for a couple of years, as a field ecologist, doing sort of bat surveys, badger surveys, newts, all the sort of on the ground field stuff, and dabbling my feet in report writing. It was a bit nebulous. I was doing lots of odd field jobs all around the place. And I also worked as sort of a large mammal scientist for Operation Modessia. I was doing lots of odd ends, but like Ashley says, the right job will sort of appear. It does take time, but yeah, I joined CIEEM in 2022 as a policy officer, and it really helped sort of cement some of those previous experiences, just building on and ending up in policy, which is a totally new world, really.
Great. Thank you very much, Doug. So a bit about me. I did start in more or less ecology and biological sciences, although I did do all the sort of biochem and genetics and that sort of stuff as well. But by the end of it was focused mostly on ecology, and then did an MSc in conservation and management. I joined CIEEM as it was then back in 2005 as an intern. I thought that would be 3 months and I'd move on and find something else. And I'm still here, so I'm a bit of the furniture now, really. But I have been incredibly lucky in my career journey in that I joined, there were 4 members of staff. I'm not sure what the membership numbers were, something like 1,500, 2,000. And so I've been able to grow and develop as the organization has developed as well. So yeah, I've just been really lucky, I think. So yeah, nearly 20 years in the job now, mostly on policy. For the first 13 odd years of that, it was just me doing all sorts of bits and pieces, not just policy. Random things I had to learn when I first joined, but things like learning HTML so I could edit the website. So yeah, odd bits of skills that you pick up along the way. I'm a full member and a chartered environmentalist. I'm also a trustee of a nature conservation charity, so trying to do my bit to put back a bit. I also have some voluntary roles, trying to do more of the hands-on nature conservation stuff, so keep my hand in with that kind of stuff. I'm also a STEM ambassador, so I'm actually doing a talk this week for 7 and 8-year-olds on trees and climate change, which should be interesting. And I'm a parish councillor, so sort of local politics and community stuff. I don't necessarily get this question that much anymore, but when I first started, people asked me a lot about don't you miss field work and why policy, and I do really enjoy the hands-on conservation stuff and getting out in the field, but I think there's such a big impact that you can make in policy and that interaction with politics and economics and other sectors that I just find it really interesting and fascinating, and I mean, I'm in it to make the world a better place, so I feel like this is where we can do it. Certainly not to take away from on the ground stuff, we need that as well, but yeah, I really enjoy that interface. So moving on, I just wanted to, one too many. I just want to talk quickly about how we define policy, and when we talk about policy, what we're actually talking about. Policy in itself could be defined as many things, but when we talk about policy, we're talking about legislation and policy that is related to that effectively. So they're two related things and work with and against each other, I suppose, in a way. But they are distinct things in terms of definition. So policies are things like guidance and principles, often issued by government agencies or government departments, for example. And legislation is the actual pieces of legislation. So there's things like primary legislation, so acts of parliament, for example. And they're more generally directly enforceable by a court of law, as it were. But the two things can influence each other. So the bit I've got at the bottom there is around policies can be used to inform and support development of legislation, but also legislation may incorporate policy objectives into legally binding frameworks. So that sounds really convoluted. An example of that would be something like biodiversity net gain, which was created by the Environment Act that mandated that it become a law, that we have to do it. But then it was policy that came after that said, okay, this is how you're going to do it. This is the requirement. This is how it's going to work. You've got the metric, that kind of thing that came afterwards. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about the policy, but obviously linked to a piece of legislation, an act of law. So sticking with that for a moment, just want to talk about legislation and how it's created. So it goes through various phases. It's different for the different countries. If we use Westminster as an example, often pieces of legislation will start as a green paper. That's not necessarily government policy at the time. It will be basically floating ideas and looking for feedback. That might then become a white paper, which would be government position, which they would then consult on. That might then be taken forward to Parliament as a bill or a private member's bill, as the PMB there. So the government might take it, or any member of Parliament can introduce something. It's very rare for a private member's bill to get very far on anything, but it does introduce things to Parliament. It can create a debate. And for example, the Climate Change Act that we have now was originally introduced as a private member's bill, but the government then took it up, and it was Theresa May's government that eventually then took it through. So it can spark change and set things on their way. And then the graphics I've got there just show the processes that a bill will go through. So whether it starts in the House of Lords or the House of Commons, and then it will bounce between the two, and then it gets into the final stages where we consider any amendments from both of the houses, and then it gets royal assent, and at that point a bill then becomes an act. So for example, the Environment Bill, as it started, then became the Environment Act. And then layering on that, we've got secondary legislation, which a government can introduce, sometimes with, sometimes without debate and amendments from Parliament, but are much easier to take through and don't have that long, convoluted process, although necessary process, I suppose, for democracy. Something else to point out at this point is that we work across the whole of the UK, so all of the devolved nations plus the Republic of Ireland, and the environment is a devolved competence, which means that each of those countries can do their own thing, as it were, on environment. So devolved competence means they can create the law, set the policies, guidance, standards. Some other examples of devolved competence are things like agriculture and planning, education, and then the opposite of that are reserved matters, which are only taken in Westminster for the whole of the UK, and things like that would be foreign policy or military defense, that kind of thing, where Westminster has the say, and that's it. The other countries don't get a say in. The point the reason I raised this is that although each of these countries are trying to achieve the same thing, we all want nature recovery and we all want sustainable agriculture and integrated planning and all that kind of thing. The way that they're doing it and the policies that they're introducing to do these are moving further and further apart and keep diverging. So our job keeps getting bigger, really, and keeping track of all of it is a bigger and bigger job. And when we come back to things like careers, there are often scopes to do things in each individual country. There are roles on very specific things in each country now. And then just to mention the Republic of Ireland, which has similar processes, has its own parliament, obviously, and is also obviously still a member of the EU, unlike sadly the rest of us. So we do keep an eye on what's going on in the EU with directives and regulations, which apply to Ireland, obviously. So that's a flying visit there. We'll talk quickly about policy and where it comes from. So generally, there's some or other need or desire to change something, and that might be someone lobbying for something because they think there's a problem with something, or a new piece of legislation, or an amendment to a piece of legislation, or a change in policy. And then we get what's called the policy cycle, where the problem's raised, we look for a solution or a change in the way to do things. We try and get them adopted, implemented into policy, and then there's that review process, and we can go back to the identifying the problem, whether you still have a problem and whether you need to carry on. The second little triangle I've got there is around the interface between policy, practice, and research. So obviously we're focused on policy, but those policies all then create something that needs to be put into practice that's implemented. So a lot of our members on the ground are implementing policy on protected species, protected sites, biodiversity net gain, all of those kinds of things. So how it's actually being implemented on the ground then. And then the one that's often forgotten, but I think has a really vital role, is the research and that interplay with, well, are those interventions actually working, which comes into play there. But also then the feedback from on the ground can say, well, these are the things that are working, and these are the things that we don't know. So you can feed that back into research and say, well, these are the things that need to be researched. So here's potential projects, students, PhDs, that kind of thing. And then you can feed that back into the policy and say, well, here's some things we can do to bring that into legislation so that we have to do it. So that little triangle is really important, but we don't always hit all of the bits of it, unfortunately, when it comes to policy, not just us, I mean, UK generally. And then the last little list there, I just wanted to highlight that policy and guidance can come from various levels. So there's things that come out at the international level. So we've got things like the Convention on Biological Diversity. The most recent example of that is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which we're all starting to implement things like 30 by 30. And then the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, so things like the Paris Agreement, and follow on from that. And then at the national level, so the two examples I've got there, I've got the NPPF, which is the National Planning Policy Framework. So that's England's kind of guiding document on planning. Scotland has an equivalent called the National Planning Framework 4, the 4th edition of it. So it shows the divergence again, where countries are doing things in different ways, but ultimately for the same goal, more or less. And then at the local level, there is also still scope for policy to be changed. So biodiversity net gain is another example of this, although it's been squeezed a bit more recently with a slight change. When it originally came out, local authorities could determine whether they wanted to go beyond the 10% gain. So in the legislation, 10% was the minimum, that was the floor. But some local authorities chose to introduce a 20% or even a 30%, I think, requirement. So that's where they can change things on the ground. And then city mayors also have a certain amount of power to introduce things. So an example of this is the ultra low emission zone in some of our cities across England. So applying visits, and we'll move on to why engage with policy, and we're going to move over to Doug.
Yeah, so this is just, I guess, a really quick overview of why I think we engage with policy, but also why lots of organizations and individuals do as well. So I think, as you can see from sort of how Jason laid it out, policy is obviously incredibly important. It moves forward into legislation, into acts, which are then enforceable, which means that you can have some really widespread sweeping changes. So I think, on a baseline to try and change something, I think that's why we're really engaged with policy, why we're we sort of look how it changes and how it changes over time, and we're really engaged with the process and all the different avenues that go into it. And there are lots of people who are paid to do this. Career lobbyists is a full-time job for some, who are paid, and their job is to engage with policy and to try and make sure that certain political aims or goals are put forward into legislation. So, they are always lobbying, they're always pushing, they're contacting MPs, they're trying to get their bills into Parliament, all those sort of avenues to try and make sure that something becomes a reality in legislation and under law. And, I think to make the world a better place, now and future generations, I think that maybe it's a double-edged sword. One of the things that policy is, it can be really long-lasting. Obviously, it can be revoked, but that does require a process to do. There's a lot of debate and discussion that goes into it. Once something is policy, you at least have some assurance that it's got some level of longevity. We've seen with the sort of the Environment Act in the UK, they've been going for a long time, and they've provided protection for hundreds and thousands of different individuals of protected species, and are incredibly important. And those sorts of acts which were put in place have had a real lifespan of ecological protection. So I think in the sort of the world of nature conservation, environmental policy, there are obviously lots and lots of reasons. I think we can all, share these, that we're in a very nature depleted country. The UK is one of the most depleted countries in the world in terms of our nature. The classic arguments, there's no planet B, this is what we've got. We've got to make sure that we can try and it's not just because things look nice. It's not just because we want these species to thrive because they intrinsically have value. It's also they're incredibly important for how we go about our daily lives. Everything we do relies on a functioning biosphere. We need these things to be working for us to continue in the way we do, for us to have agriculture in any way, shape, or form. We need biodiversity underpinning it all. So, and I think generally, and I've encountered this in policy, and I think I sometimes seesaw on this point, but I think a lot of people do want to do the right thing, but there's always lots of opinions on what the right thing is. And that's where that sort of research element that Jason was talking about, and that sort of practical in the field element comes in. And that's really trying to ascertain what the right thing is. And there's lots of different opinions, even within the field of ecology, and even then smaller on what's good for individual species. There are experts who have different opinions based on their experiences, but it's really important that you have that research element to find those routes that work best in policy. You know, and all these issues are interrelated: climate, biodiversity, those two crises happening at the same time. And at the same time, things like, you know, stagnating economic growth. Lots of people are making arguments that that is because of the state of biodiversity. So all these things are interlinked, and policy is where you can try and engage and try and wrestle it into a shape that can push forward in a way you want. And we have evidence and solutions at a baseline. You know, we know what the right answer is. We know what we need to be doing, and it's making sure we push the way there. And really, policy is that vehicle. You know, we've got the science, we've got the data, but it's making sure that that becomes legislation that we can then, that is protected under law. So you can make sure that protection is enforced and has that sort of level of lifespan that we need. Thanks, Jason. Next slide. So sort of carrying on from that, on, you know, why individuals or why organizations, why does CIEEM engage with policy? And really, CIEEM's been engaging with policy, you know, since the very beginning in a way, shape, or form. But the chartered body, as a chartered body, you know, we want to advance the understanding and the standards of practice for ecology and environmental management for the benefit of the natural environment and the public good, and to further conservation, management, and enhancement of biodiversity and the maintenance of ecological processes and life support systems essential to a fully functional biosphere. And the route towards that, at least in our opinion, is through policy. You know, we can do a lot of this through our members and the work our members do, but also policy is a way we can drive forward those core beliefs that CIEEM has into trying to make the world a better place and to raise those standards. You know, and we're trying to raise the standards and the profile of ecologists, environmental professionals. And a way to do that is policy, making sure that those are enshrined and the work that those people need to do is protected in the way that they do that work. So yeah, you know, we're trying to achieve that mission through policy and by making sure that we are advising government, by we're challenging government, and we're making sure that we're in that role to sort of fulfill that mission as best we can. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Doug. Ashley, over to you.
Thank you. So now I'll talk a little bit more in detail about how CIEEM engages with policy. So for CIEEM, much of our policy work is largely the product of collaboration between our volunteers and staff. Many of our policy volunteers are members either of the Strategic Policy Panel or of a country policy group, although notably there's also Action 2030, which Doug will go into in a little bit more detail later. So the Strategic Policy Panel, or SPP, have an overview of what's happening in relation to environmental policy across the UK and Ireland. And they keep an eye on that and they set a direction for policy. And they work closely with Jason as our head of policy, who in turn works closely with the policy officers, myself and Doug, but also the country coordinators, as mentioned earlier. And we in turn support the country policy groups, of which there are 4, as Jason mentioned, each for England, Scotland, Wales, and the island of Ireland. And they in turn consist of around 14 members, although sometimes there are positions open and we look to recruit fairly regularly. They have a chair or co-chairs, and those co-chairs also have the opportunity to sit on the strategic policy panel and be a direct link between the SPP and the country policy group. And also the vice president, who isn't officially part of the country policy group, but who will review outputs and will have final sign off before we publish them on our website or submit them to a government. So among the activities of country policy groups are producing outputs, and probably the main outputs would be briefing and position papers. And the main purpose of these is to provide our overview and perspective of either current or near future issues. We might also write letters, and these are mainly to raise specific views or concerns with decision makers. We'll also respond to consultations and inquiries. These are often to questions posed by either government or committees. And we also engage with the public, and that can be through policy events, sometimes in collaboration with other organisations, also through our in-house magazine, In Practice, through blogs on our website, newsletters, and of course the podcast. Next slide, please, Jason. So a little bit more about our policy volunteers, who, as mentioned, are really key to our policy work. and might either sit in a strategic policy panel or in a country policy group. As mentioned, there are four for each of the devolved nations and the island of Ireland, as well as Action 2030. And it's really important that we operate at the level of nations because, as Jason mentioned, a lot of sectors which are relevant to CIEEM's policy work are devolved, and that includes the environment, planning, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, etc. So volunteers are critical to our policy work, but volunteers do not need to have policy experience. What we do look for is the motivation to use your specific ecological experience to influence change and to support our activities and policy. Also, that you're interested in learning more about policy and for helping us to monitor the horizon and keep an eye on any emerging issues. Important to note here that as of, I think, last year, 2024, qualifying members can now join for 1 3-year term. And thereafter, you can rejoin as either when you become either an associate or a full member for up to 9 years or 3 terms. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Ooh, 1 too many. Bit trigger happy. So just want to talk quickly about how we engage, continuing that conversation. So we respond to a whole range of things, and we are proactive in some other areas where we want to raise the conversations about particular issues. But running through almost everything that we do are some very common messages. And obviously there will be particulars about whatever the topic is that we're talking about. But these common threads that we run through everything are pretty much ubiquitous across our policy activities, and they're around the fact that as an institute we work to raise standards. We're constantly working on guidance, and the professional standards team works really hard on that. Talking about supporting professionals, the fact that if we don't have the expertise and the capacity within the sector to do the things that we need to do, we aren't going to be able to protect nature, never mind enhance and recover nature. So those are often a common theme in our work. We talk about maintaining and enhancing the natural environment, making sure that there's no regression on that and always looking forward. Often it comes up that climate and biodiversity are separated. We've seen that in recent policy where net zero goes off in its own direction and nature sort of gets left behind or goes off in a different direction. And we're having to constantly pull these things back together and saying that we're never going to solve these issues if we look at them independently. They need to be looked at together. Everything we do is in the public benefit. Pretty much everything our members do, even if they're working for a private company, is in the public benefit. What we do and the reason we got chartered status is because what we do and what our members do is in the public benefit. It's for the benefit of society and as Doug mentioned earlier, underpins our economy. And that we're always willing to work in collaboration and partnership, and whether that's with other NGOs, with umbrella groups, or often we'll end our consultation responses in our position papers with something along the lines of being open to working with government, and we have lots of open conversations and ongoing discussions with government agencies and departments and civil servants around how we can work more closely together. So moving on and sticking with that a little bit, how we engage. So we have some key principles that we put together on how we engage with policy, and these are very high level things for us to keep in mind about how we work rather than getting into the specifics of topics or our messaging, as it were. So having some very clear goals, making sure what we think the end point is, where do we actually want to get to with whatever it is we're engaging with. Knowing who to influence is really critical. The two images you've got there, one of those is at the top on the right is Mary Cray. She's currently the Nature Minister in DEFRA. And on the bottom on the right, that's Matthew Pennycook, is a planning minister in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. So depending on what it is we're trying to engage with, you'd be going to different ministers potentially, or different civil servants, different agencies. Might even be someone different entirely, but knowing who the right person is part of the process. Knowing that timing is critical. I talked earlier about the process of taking a bill through Parliament and it becoming an act. There's certain points in that where it's possible to influence things and other parts where it isn't. So knowing where that happens. If you can get earlier in all of those processes, you bring it back to the white paper in the consultation, or even earlier into the green paper. If you can get involved even earlier than that in the initial discussions, even better. And you can guide where those things go then when it starts to get to government putting its ideas together. Working in partnership, there's always value in a common voice, and we do an awful lot of this, as I think Ashley will talk about later. We recognize that competition is healthy, so there's others in the sector also doing this, also asking for very similar things. Sometimes we work with them, sometimes we do our own thing. Often we can learn from each other though, so we think that's a good thing. Building a network is really important as well. So like we've got there, the images of meeting with MPs, and we've got some relationships with particular MPs on particular issues. Building relationships with civil servants, obviously members, is critically important, knowing who the right person is to talk to when a particular topic comes up. Obviously, we try to base all of our positions and our briefings on actual evidence. So that might be research, but it also could be the combined experience of our members. That is an evidence base as well. Understanding the context is pretty critical to what we do, and a good example of that is not taking something that's done in England and taking it to Scottish politicians and say, hey, we think you should do this because it's what's done in England. That will go down like a lead balloon. So understanding how these things fit together, and sometimes it is understanding the politics of it, is important as well. We always make sure that whenever we are responding to something or putting together a briefing or a position paper, that we are proposing solutions, that we're not just ranting about a problem or an issue. That we are actually coming up with ideas and ways that we can fix things, and often looking at ways where we can find win-win situations or solutions. We have to remember that policy is a long game. There are some things that take decades to get into legislation, and that it's about incremental changes along the way. Obviously, we try to learn from everything we do. So every new policy initiative we have, we try and review and make sure we're learning from that and try and improve what we do for the next time. Being proud of our achievements is something that we're probably a little bit guilty of not doing enough. We work behind the scenes a lot, and then don't celebrate our successes enough. And I think that's really important in terms of that playing the long game, that every little achievement you have to celebrate and keep up morale and keep chipping away. Efficiently using our resources. We're a pretty small team. We get great support from our volunteers, as Ashley said, but we need to make sure we're focusing on where we can have the most impact. So sometimes that does mean saying no to things. And then obviously taking our members along with us on the journey. So whether that's directly engaged with actually trying to influence policy, or keeping them updated with what's happening. So those are our key principles for engagement. And we're going to talk a little bit now about some recent activities. So we'll start with Doug and UK and England examples. Doug, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, so sort of going on from, some of those principles that we abide by when doing policy, I think it's quite nice to run through some sort of, highlights. Last year in sort of the UK and England, policy was really dominated by the general election, as you might guess. That really sort of dominated the first, the middle of the year. And then following on from that, Labour's sort of, setting out and getting into their stride about how they were going to begin to approach nature and infrastructure. So I think one of the ones to pull out there is our document, which is the UK government's nature recovery agenda. So this was really this was 7 points that we gave to government, which is what we would like to see from nature within their, within their sort of 4 years, and the things that CIEEM as a chartered institute believes would be beneficial for both the economy, for nature, and for people. So some highlights with that, for looking at, fully funding and resourcing public bodies delivering for nature, incentivizing nature positive business and finance, supporting the growth of nature related green economy. So this was, they were quite high level, but they were specific goals and aims that we wanted to achieve. And within policy, as has been mentioned, being specific is really advantageous. If you can go to government, or if you can go to policymakers and you can give a solution-based approach, you can say, instead of saying this is the problem and then not providing a solution, but if you can go to them and say, this is a concrete example of what we want to see and why we want to see it, and you can give pathways to achieving it, or you can give examples where it's already happening, that really helps your argument, it pushes it further down the chain. And so another one to highlight there, I think, is the consultation document. So this is a big part of what we in the policy team do, is consultations. So this is providing feedback, rebuttal, advice, guidance to government on a number of issues. In this case, this is the planning reform working paper, which is the government's trying to set out how they're going to be approaching planning. You know, the government is about build, build, build. This is them trying to evaluate how the planning system works. And for us, what we're interested in is how that interacts with nature. You know, a huge amount of ecologists and environmental managers and our membership are employed on that boundary of development, you know, making sure that when you develop, that you're not bulldozing nature and you're not sort of providing benefits. You're not, you know, now you need to adhere to BNG in England. So making sure that nature can benefit from these economic growth incentives. So in that, you know, really we're trying to make sure that throughout that process, we engage with our members, we get guidance on it, we get feedback, we then sort of tweak it, make sure the language is correct. There's lots of collaboration, and we try and make sure that we're really emphasizing that nature is not a barrier to development or economic growth. Nature recovery and development work hand in hand. It's on our website, on our resource hub, and I think these are some really good examples of how that process takes place. You know, it's a good insight by looking at these documents to how policy works, the sort of the nitty gritty, which is that often that consultation engagement, which we're all, you know, which the policy team is quite familiar with, and looking at how we can try and provide advice. So I think these are some examples. There's also a picture there, I think that's a Jason of the BNG seminar or webinar that he was delivering, which he's been doing quite a lot of. Obviously, BNG is hot on the news still, despite, you know, coming into place a little while ago now, and BNG still is the big thing, really looking at, and again, we engage on that. You know, it's not just if something comes into policy, great, we sort of rub our hands with it, move on to the next thing. These things have teething issues, they develop, and often the stress testing that happens when it's out in people's hands, essentially, you don't see until it's out there. So now we can really engage with that process of fine-tuning it and making sure that it is delivering for nature, but is also still not, you know, hindering development, which nature never really does. Nature is always the scapegoat, but nature doesn't get in the way of development, as a little plug. But that's some sort of overview of what some of our recent policy activities in the UK and England are. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Doug. Moving on to Scotland then, Ashley.
Thank you. So I'm conscious that time's creeping on, so I am going to whiz through these very quickly, but always invite further questions about anything in particular via our policy at CIEEM.net. So in Scotland, recent activities include an example of specialist knowledge feeding into a collaborative activity. So a member of our policy team helped co-author a report on invasive non-native species in Scotland. As you can see, the cover rather graphic on the far left there. This led to a parliamentary motion and a chamber debate in the Scottish Parliament, so a very clear demonstration of impact there. The Scotland Policy Group fed into the consultation on the Scottish biodiversity strategy in a lot of detail just a couple of years ago. That strategy was finally published in autumn of last year, and we're pleased to say that a lot of the things that we asked for are in there. So we're now keeping an eye on targets for biodiversity in the Natural Environment Bill, as those will be quite critical to ensuring the actions outlined in the strategy do come about. We also, as Doug says, biodiversity net gain occupies quite a lot of our policy activity still, either BNG or its variants in the different nations, as you'll see in the next few slides. And we're currently in the process of writing a paper in Scotland on what else besides a metric would support the success of BNG in Scotland. And we're also coming off the back of what was done for the UK general election last year, are preparing some asks to make of political parties in advance of the Scottish election in 2026. Next slide, please, Jason. So in Wales, we also responded to a number of consultations, including on the sustainable farming scheme, agriculture being devolved, of course, and on an environmental watchdog for Wales, which Wales is the only country besides Northern Ireland, I believe, that doesn't yet have a environmental watchdog for that particular nation, although the OEP do operate in Northern Ireland. We also responded to a call for evidence on halting and reversing the loss of nature by 2030, and are quoted several times throughout. And we have worked very closely with the Welsh Government on their BNG alternative, which is net benefits for biodiversity, including currently we're coordinating a working group to progress guidance on NBB. We also have been invited to join the Welsh Government's Biodiversity Targets panel. This will directly feed into the development of statutory targets for biodiversity to help Wales meet its commitments to halt and reverse biodiversity decline. And as in Scotland, we'll be preparing some asks ahead of the Senedd elections in 2026. Next slide, please. And in Ireland last year, we produced a briefing paper on what BNG in Ireland might look like, the intention of which was to spark some informed conversation about the topic, which we've since had. And we have then run a large survey looking for views, public views, mainly from ecologists, but it was open to everyone, on the details of what BNG might look like in Ireland. And this is going to inform a position paper on the topic, which should be out later this year. Liz, our country coordinator, has been leading a partnership project that's looking specifically at the capacity gap in the profession and how to fill this. She's also been leading interaction with the Irish Planning Institute, where as a collaborative entity, we've been looking at any shared interests we have and clear actions for collaboration. And we have also been invited to join a leaders forum to support the development of a national nature restoration plan, which is a requirement of all EU nations by 2026, as per the European Nature Restoration Law.
Doug, back to you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Yeah, so this is just sort of an overview of some of the international policy activities. And at the moment, that's very much taken up by the COP. So that's the conference, the UN's Conference of Parties. So COP16, which was the biodiversity COP, and then COP29, which was the climate-based COP. So CIEEM has official observer status, so we can often virtually, because that's the easiest route and doesn't involve a huge amount of traveling. We can virtually attend sort of the programs, we can watch them as they go, and then we also try and write news items as they go, sort of giving CIEEM's opinion on what's been going on and where those developments are. So yeah, those are all up on our website if you want to have a look. And generally, the COP16 was quite a positive process, whereas COP29 was less so, but still making some progress. And that's that's our international lens at the moment, is how we sort of interact with those programs.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Ashley, back to you.
Thank you. So volunteers are critical and collaboration is key. And we do collaborate directly and often with a number of key partners, including the Institute of Chartered Foresters, British Ecological Society, and the Institution of Civil Engineers, but not limited to those. Collaboration could be shared events, it could be working together to respond to a consultation, or it could be collaborating together to produce some guidance on a subject. We also collaborate with a number of environmental NGOs, and we do this mainly through what are called environment links. You can see their logos there on the right. And these are essentially umbrella groups of NGOs that mainly work in the environmental sector and range in size from big and international, such as WWF and the RSPB, down to small and local. And what these do is they pool a wide range of expertise into group efforts. And this could be particularly useful for, say, responding to consultations that are connected to our interests, but for which we don't have the necessary expertise. So there are links that are specific to each nation, but they do work together on shared matters. For example, the Aarhus Convention. That's an international agreement that gives the public the right to access information, participate in decision-making, and access justice on environmental matters, which is a rumbling concern for all links in all nations. Thank you, Jason.
Ashley, did you want to mention the EPF there?
I would invite yourself to talk about the EPF, as I'm not so familiar with their activities.
Sure, no problem. So as a sort of in parallel with working with the link groups, which are mostly NGOs, we also work with what's called the Environmental Policy Group, which is a collaboration of mostly professional bodies in the environment sector, but also some learned society. So the two things work in parallel, really, and those are our main conduits for collaboration. Doug, back to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so one of the sort of the secret source of policy is who to influence. Often it's sort of how to apply that policy pressure almost to the right places to make the most impact. So in CIEEM, often, obviously, as you could guess, parliamentarians, so ministers, shadow ministers, backbenchers, peers, select committees, APPGs, which is an all-party parliamentary group, which is a cross-collaborative, cross-party group, which anyone with an interest in a specific subject can join. Those are really, really useful because often there is more consensus than you might think, despite party lines and despite it being often quite divided as it may seem. Often there's quite a lot of, especially with nature and climate, there's a lot of crossover. So you might have quite a lot of conservatives who are actually more environmentally minded and we're willing to collaborate on that particular issue. So that's where the sort of these APPGs come into play. Civil servants, SNCOs, ALBs. This also applies to people working within things like DEFRA, Natural England, Natural Resources Wales, those sorts of aspects across the different nations. And those people we often communicate with, we often have regular meetings with representatives from those organizations, just sort of information sharing, seeing what's going on, trying to get an idea of the direction of travel, which is also really useful so we know what to anticipate. The public opinion is massive. Last year there were huge marches for nature. Those have been really, really useful and important, I think, for driving up the profile of the biodiversity crisis, and also obviously climate change has had huge protests which have sort of pushed it to the top of the agenda. But the public being informed and the public putting pressure on Parliament and their local MPs is really, really important. And I think we'll touch that a bit on sort of in the next slide. But then also celebrities, it can't really be understated. People like Chris Packham, Tara McAulty, David Lindo, the people who have high profile names are really, really good for, again, getting the public engaged, but also being someone that the parliamentarians in government can't really ignore because they're making lots of noise and kicking up a big fuss, which is great. And media and journalists. So ENDS is a really sort of high level focused, I guess you could do a news reporting platform, and they give quite detailed breakdowns on legislation, things that come out, Telegraph, Country File, BBC Breakfast, looking at how you can sort of try and influence those. We've done interviews with various organizations as well, trying to get CIEEM's voice out there. And then other sectors, making sure that we're not just focused on the politics, we're also looking at developers. We work, as she said, we have lots of collaborations with lots of organizations, and often those people, that filters down to house builders, people who are working on development, people who are actually doing the work. And it's really important to try and find out what your audience is interested in, the sort of, and then what you can add to that, particularly what the mutual benefit might be. So for example, we do quite a lot of work with Kew Gardens, and you have to try and find the aims and ambitions that cross collaborate. Obviously, Kew Gardens, horticulture, environment, history. We've attended sort of the APPG talks there as well. Next slide, please, Jason. So some mechanisms for influencing. I won't go through all of these, but I think it's really important to sort of, there's a huge breadth of ways you can get involved and you can try and influence, and social media is a really, really powerful tool. Obviously, as ever with social media, make sure you're being a bit wary. AI is sort of creeping up and AI bots becoming more and more prevalent. So it's always good to be cautious on those platforms, and it might mean that politicians begin to steer clear of them. But local MPs are a really, really good way to try and influence policy. We in CIEEM try and influence our local MPs, and then we try and filter that up. We've on the website, we've got a little document which is just ways you can influence your local MP, and a little guideline, but also some a little resource that helps you do that. And that sort of grassroots politics is really important for the environment, particularly because the environment, as ever, is always a local issue. It's often these local settings which people interact with, get involved with, and that's how they get involved in sort of environment and nature conservation. So it's really important to maintain that. But we also try and make sure we host parliamentary receptions with particular MPs who are sort of who are really keen on the environment front, exhibitions, conferences, workshops, webinars like this. All these sorts of different avenues throughout media, but also sort of in person, are really important to try and influence policy. And it all culminates in that process of trying to push an act through Parliament, but also that sort of longevity process afterwards, that tail end. So that's just a really good overview of how we try and do it. And position papers, briefing papers, as you could obviously tell, as we talked about those previously, very important for that too. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Doug. So last couple of slides, reviewing our activities.
Yes, so why review your activities and your impact? Well, it helps you learn what works and what doesn't, a little bit of reflection. It also provides some accountability to members, funders, and boards because, as a lot of knowledge work, it can be quite difficult to demonstrate productivity or what you're actually doing. So it's important to record those activities. And on the right-hand side, you can see these colourful squares. Well, these are actually policy infographics, which are built from our records of what we do year to year, and they can be found on our website if you want to see a little bit more detail. Uh, it's also important for morale and perseverance, as it can feel an awful lot of the time like you're swimming against the tide, and that your actions don't contribute to much. But actually, if you look back and reflect, you'll find that progress has been made. And how do you identify impact? Well, it might be a legislative or policy change or a direct shout out, either through independent efforts. So we have the example of the Environmental Audit Committee produced a report which identified chartered ecologists as being key to raising standards in this area. It could be through a partnership effort. So a good example of that is Biodiversity Net Gain in England, where CIEEM collaborated with a number of organisations to progress that and actually provide some concrete detail as to what that would look like. It might be being quoted in reports, as mentioned earlier. CIEEM's been quoted in reports across the UK by both government and committees, parliamentary committees. You might be directly invited to engage with government or to give oral evidence to committees. And in that image in the top right there is the example of Ben Kite, who's on our strategic policy panel, who recently gave evidence in Parliament in relation to planning reforms. It can be difficult to demonstrate individual impact through consultations, but these are still important because it reinforces messages that have been made by others as well as yourself in previous engagement activities. So they are a key part of this, even if they don't always feel like they are the most worthwhile activity. And the key thing is to be, as Jason said earlier, prepared to play the long game. Take small, carefully chosen steps, things that are palatable to decision makers and parliamentarians, but which will take you in the right direction ultimately towards your goal. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Ashley. And then I think our last two slides are on careers. Doug.
Yeah, and that's me. Okay, so yeah, after we've talked about policy, and clearly it's incredibly interesting, exciting, but also really important. How would you get engaged? So if you are interested in environmental policy as a career, I think that the first and best thing to do is always to get informed, and there are lots and lots of different ways to do that. We have CIEEM has our e-briefing, which is a sort of a monthly news that goes out and just it's a really sort of high level. What are the snapshots in policy, really? What's going on? What are the things that we think members are interested in, but also what we think is pertinent? In practice, the Quarterly Magazine is a really, really good resource for that. But also NGOs also have lots and lots of different newsletters. There's lots of ways you can try and get engaged with what's going on in policy. ENDS is really good. But also newspapers, newspapers like The Guardian always have sort of environmental editors, and they're always putting out different articles on things that are going on legislation. Those are always really good ways to sort of get involved slowly, to begin to get an understanding of how these things change, how they happen, and how people put them into place. Green Jobs for Nature is a fantastic place to get started as well. So this is run by CIEEM. I would advise everyone to go and have a look at it, to look through the different career profiles, how different people got involved in ecology, but also how different people got involved in policy. And also the crossover there. Often it's cross-pollinated. A lot of people who end up in policy might not have envisioned that, but it's just turned out that is the way they feel they can make the most impact, and they've sort of jumped across and gone across the barrier and gone from practical ecology or consultancy work into policy or academia to policy. Do your background reading, NTVO, Oxfam, try and grow your experience and exposure. So local plans and local nature recovery strategies are really, really good ways of understanding, at that local nature level, how policy is impacting you. What are the things that people have put in place? What are the policy and the legislations they put in place to try and push forward nature? Try and get an understanding of that. Can you get involved? Can you try and influence it? Can you make sure it's actually happening? Try and get an understanding of the political process. Obviously, this can be quite complex, and lots of people try and switch off from the political process, but it's really important. There's a process that it goes through, and if you understand that, you can try and influence it in the best way possible. But it takes that sort of, that hurdle of trying to understand that process of a bill going through the Commons and then going into Lords, and those discussions and those debates and what those actually mean. But to really understand that, be proactive, get involved, send us emails as well, ask questions. Social media is a great way of doing it. Build your network, try and sort of connect with like-minded people, or even not like-minded people that you might want to have a debate or a discussion with. That's a really good way that we push policy forward. In Parliament, it happens through debate. There are conflicting opinions. That is something that happens in policy, and it's an important part of it as well. So there's so many different avenues, but there's also lots of ways you can begin to sort of put the seeds forward to get interested. Next slide. So who engages in environmental policy? What are some careers? So NGOs, RSPB, wildlife trusts, and almost an innumerable number of smaller ones too, things like, or huge ones, all have policy positions. And often it might not say, this is a policy officer as we have in CIEEM. It might be a conservation officer, it might be a biodiversity officer, it might be someone doing sort of smaller project management. But policy will often still be a component of those jobs. It comes into play. Because they're talking to local councils, they're talking to government. Think tanks like Green Alliance, big umbrella groups. We talked about Wildlife and Countryside Link. They have dedicated policy members of their team who help to coordinate all the different groups, all the different volunteers, and try and sort of push forward policy objectives. Professional bodies, so that's us. That's also IEMA. That's CIEEM, Chartered Institute for Waste, Environment and Water. Learned societies, the British Ecological Society, all these different organizations are doing policy work. Comms and PR policy, as you might have guessed from how we've been talking about it, what we've been talking about is comms is a huge part of it. So a lot of communication officers within businesses, those are people doing policy work. They are putting the word out there. Academics, researchers, I think this really shows that whatever avenue you've come from, you can probably find a way into policy if you want to. And even if you don't know it, you might already be doing a bit of policy work. It sort of ends up sort of putting its little tentacles everywhere. It just ends up sort of encompassing it all, which is really, really, I think fantastic. It means that lots of people can get involved, and the more people get involved in policy, the better. So I think this just shows that there's so many different ways you can get involved. But yeah, feel free to send us a message or ask any questions in the Q&A as well about policy.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I am very, very conscious of time, that we're slightly over. We've got one question that's popped up in the Q&A, so we can answer that. But I was just going to say, this is being recorded, and as far as I understand it, it's going to be made available to students on accredited courses, so you will be able to come back and watch it. I'm happy to stay on and answer questions if anyone has anything. Doug and Ashley, if you have anywhere you need to be, do feel free to drop off. But we have got a question from Lorena, which is, what have been the most significant challenges you have faced throughout your career in policy? I'll kick us off. I think for me, in policy, it's been that sort of fighting against the tide that's been mentioned. And sometimes it's just really frustrating. The example at the moment around planning, the Labour government came in and said all the right things about linking up planning and house building and nature recovery and how we can do all these things together. And then the government has taken a sort of a swerve and gone, right, well, actually, we've made this promise to build 1.5 million homes. We need to get on with building these 1.5 million homes. And how are we going to do that? So let's get rid of nature regulations. And it's just really frustrating. And that kind of thing keeps popping up over and over again. And it's always the economy, or the perception of the economy, always seems to trump nature. So that's the biggest frustration for me. If I've misinterpreted your question and it was about career and getting into the sector, I think from my point of view, I sort of fell into it and have been lucky enough to grow with the organisation. But I'll come to Ashley first, and then we can go to Doug about that question.
Okay, so yeah, I'll also approach this from both angles. Since starting to work in policy in earnest, which has only been about a year, I guess one of the major challenges I faced is frustration at consultations, because they quite often ask you the questions that you don't want to answer. They can have some very peculiar stipulations, including character limitations, which can limit what you say in them. It has been interesting trying to learn more about how consultations are interpreted because that shapes how you respond to them, but also has reassured me that they are actually used. And quite often it's just a case of making a very simple point or providing ready to copy and paste answers to very specific questions. And these will actually be noticed by the organisation or the government or committee that's running the consultation. In terms of getting into policy, getting into a policy, a career in policy, probably a major challenge is not knowing the routes in and how exactly you go about getting into policy without doing a specific degree in policy, which is by no means a requirement. I do believe that anyone can get into policy, and quite often your background, specialist knowledge, be it in ecology or any other sector, healthcare, etc., is a huge benefit to being in policy because you ought to know the subject that you're advocating for. But all that being said, it could still be difficult to understand how, if you've come from another sector, you prove your uh, worth in being picked up for a policy job. And I think that the Green Jobs for Nature website is a growing resource for that kind of information. There's quite a few profiles in there from people that have entered into policy from all different kinds of routes. I do believe, well, I'm certainly going to submit a profile after this, and hopefully Jason and Doug will as well. It's now recorded on on a webinar. But yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Thanks, Ashley. Doug?
Yeah, I mean, I think very, very similar, to be honest. And I think frustration's a big thing. And I think it's good that we mentioned earlier, you've got to try and take those sort of small wins throughout policy, because sometimes it does seem, especially if a lot of us, I think, will have come from academic, semi-academic backgrounds, or even, coming from a practical background, the answers. The answers are plain to see, easy to see, they're out there in the world, the data's there. It makes sense to people, and it makes sense to us what the solution is. And then the backtracking away from that solution, or people almost trying to swerve the solution and coming to a worse solution, is something that is really frustrating. And you can't let that sort of prevent you from continuing to pursue that end goal, which is, making sure that nature is recovering and we have a stable climate and we have people who can enjoy nature and all these different aspects, and we live sustainably. And it's that long game. It's making sure, and I'm very guilty of not always remembering to take those sort of small victories and to really take stock of it. But that's the biggest challenge I face, is that is those backtracks and trying to make people understand that we don't need to be taking those steps backwards. We can go forward with nature, and we can still grow the economy and develop and make infrastructure and do all these lovely things that economists want us to do. But we can still have a recovering natural world. And I think for a sort of a career, getting into a career in ecology, very similar to Ashley, it wasn't always my intention to go into policy, but it ended up, it just became clear to me that if I always wanted to sort of make an impact, and this would be a way I could do it, and this is an avenue I hadn't explored before in making an impact. And it's turned out that you can sort of maybe make a bigger impact than you thought you could. You can sort of try and expand your network. You can communicate with people. You can try and establish this sort of group of like-minded people to try and expand the influence of your individual views. So I think I think that sort of that route into policy has been quite interesting for me, quite different.
Thanks very much, Doug. I was just going to add to that. I think there are a lot of different ways to get into policy. I was just thinking about the people I know in policy, and I think most of the people in environmental policy have either come at it from some kind of environmental background or some kind of political background. But equally, I know people who've done things like history degrees and have come into it. So there's all sorts of ways into it. Yeah. Right, we've got a thank you there. There's only a couple of us left on the call, so if you have anything else, please do pop it in the Q&A. Otherwise, we will call it a day there. Right.
And do you consider volunteering for policy down the line if you think you're interested? We're always interested in receiving applications. And even if there isn't space on a policy group at that time, we will certainly bear you in mind.
Yeah, and you don't need to have prior policy experience at all. You can just get involved.
Yeah, I mean, for early ecologists, it really is that a different way of looking at the world, a new perspective, that really useful for us. So yeah.
Yes.
Right, I think we will call it a day there. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ashley and Doug.
Thank
Very
you.
much.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.